and usually don't do. But there comes a time when you have to speak, and silence is
The camera moves slowly through Graceland at twilight. Chandeliers flicker against glass cases, filled with sequin suits. A piano sits silent in the corner, its keys untouched since the night he left. Then her voice breaks the hush. He didn't leave me. Fame did. At 78, Priscilla Presley finally speaks the sentence she has avoided for half a century. It isn't bitterness, it's an autopsy of love. The love that once crowned her queen of rock and roll's empire, now reduced to an echo inside an empty house. Outside, tourists press their faces against the iron gates, taking photos of a myth. Inside, she sits beneath the same chandelier that once lit their wedding dinner in Las Vegas. Her hands tremble as she unfolds a faded telegram, the first message he ever sent her when she was just a teenager living in Germany. You belong to me now. It reads, a promise. Or a prophecy. For years, she believed she was chosen by destiny. The world envied her. The newspapers called it a fairy tale, the king and his bride. But fairy tales have rules. The prince must return from war. The queen must stay home. And both must pretend the crown isn't heavy. Priscilla remembers the wait. The endless phone calls. The late nights. The strangers guarding the bedroom door. The girl who once dreamed of love became the woman who waited for calls that never came. For a man who was always somewhere else. Swallowed by the roar of the crowd and the glow of Vegas neon. People think he left me, she says quietly. The truth is, he never truly came back. Behind every standing ovation, there were pills lined up on the bedside table. Behind every gold record, another argument muffled by applause. The same voice that could break a million hearts was slowly breaking his own. And somewhere between the studio lights and the stage fog, the man she loved disappeared into the legend the world demanded. Now, half a century later, she decides to open the vault of silence. To tell what really ended the marriage that millions believed was perfect. Was it infidelity, control, the darkness of addiction, or something far more tragic, the simple truth that no human love can survive the machinery of myth tonight? Priscilla Presley pulls back the velvet curtain on the dream that devoured her life. And for the first time, the world may finally hear what it costs to love the king who couldn't stay. For the world. It began like a modern fairy tale. He was already a myth before he was a man, Elvis Presley. The boy from Tupelo who sang his way out of poverty and into eternity. She was the quiet teenager in Germany, eyes wide, heart open, unaware that a single evening at a military base would alter her life forever. When their photographs first appeared in Life magazine, the story seemed pre-written by destiny itself. The king had found his queen. America wanted to believe it. A white limousine, a glittering diamond ring, the shy smile of a young bride in lace. These were the images that the press turned into scripture. Their wedding in Las Vegas in 1967 lasted only 8 minutes. Yet the world replayed those minutes for decades. Reporters wrote that Priscilla looked like a porcelain doll, perfect and still, while Elvis beamed beside her as though he had conquered heaven itself. Cameras flashed, champagne poured, and the newlyweds posed under a banner that read, "Love me tender, forever." For a while, it was easy to believe the slogan. The birth of Lisa Marie a year later completed the sacred portrait. Graceland became the palace of a new American royalty. Inside, chandeliers glowed, carpets softened every step, and the laughter of guests mixed with the hum of distant amplifiers. Elvis would sit at the piano after midnight, singing lullabies only his wife and daughter could hear. Sometimes Priscilla filmed him with a small Super 8 camera, the grainy images showing a man unguarded, barefoot, laughing to the public. This was proof that fame and family could coexist. To Priscilla, it was rehearsal. Each smile, each kiss, Each carefully chosen moment became part of the choreography that kept the illusion alive. The fans demanded it. They wrote letters addressed to the perfect couple. They camped outside Graceland, hoping for a glimpse of the white Cadillac or the wave from behind the gate. When Elvis walked onto a stage, women screamed his name when Priscilla appeared beside him. They applauded her composure. She had become the nation's emblem of devotion, the woman who tamed the king. Behind the flashbulbs, she studied the role that fame required. Makeup flawless, voice gentle, opinions measured. A single wrong word could collapse the fantasy. She learned that in Hollywood's kingdom, silence was a kind of armor. There were good days, long drives in the desert, laughter echoing across the mansion's halls, the simple warmth of family dinners before the tours began again. But even those moments carried a rhythm she couldn't control. Elvis' schedule was written in neon and adrenaline studio sessions until dawn. Rehearsals, flights, concerts, fans. The same hands that once held her face tenderly now waved endlessly to crowds. At first, she waited. As wives were taught to wait, she arranged flowers in the living room, folded the baby's clothes, and counted the hours until his return. She believed that patience could bridge any distance. When he came home, the house came alive, the entourage followed. The music blasted. Gifts arrived by truckload. The king never traveled alone. His friends, called the Memphis Mafia, filled every corner with laughter and noise. They played cards, shot pool, and drank until sunrise. Somewhere among the clatter, Priscilla moved quietly, a ghost in her own palace. She told herself this was love's price, the tax of being loved by someone who belonged to everyone. But love shared with the world becomes thinner with each encore. The public saw glamour, she felt gravity. To keep the image intact, she smiled for the magazines, held Lisa Marie at perfect angles, and spoke softly about how proud she was. "He's a wonderful husband," she repeated, though the words tasted rehearsed. When Elvis prepared for his '68 comeback special, she watched him transform again. Makeup, leather suit, sweat glistening under the lights. The show was a triumph. The audience roared as if resurrecting a god. Backstage, he collapsed into her arms, trembling with exhaustion and relief. For a fleeting second, she saw the boy from Tupelo again, the dreamer, not the deity. But by morning, the machine had restarted. New contracts, new tours, new temptations. In interviews, she praised his dedication. In private, she counted the days he spent at home. Weeks turned into months. Sometimes a phone call replaced a visit. Sometimes even that failed to come. Every love story in Hollywood must serve an audience. And the Presley marriage became the longest-running performance of them all. Reporters still called them soulmates. She called herself his anchor. Yet the truth was quieter. She was the audience, clapping for a man who could no longer hear her. The illusion endured because it had to. The myth of Elvis depended on her silence as much as on his voice. She wore the crown, but it was heavy. She kept the house immaculate, the smile practiced, the story believable. One evening, after another endless tour, she waited by the window as headlights swept across the driveway. When the door finally opened, she saw not the husband shed married, but a shadow of him, eyes hidden behind sunglasses, skin pale under artificial tan, hands shaking slightly as he reached for his pills. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "I am home, baby." But his voice sounded as if it came from far away, like a broadcast from another planet. Priscilla closed the door behind him and stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back wore diamonds, but her eyes no longer sparkled. To the rest of the world, the Presley empire still shone brighter than ever sold-out shows. Gold records, headlines about success. Inside the gates, something delicate was fracturing, almost imperceptibly, like fine china cracking under its own gloss. She once told a friend, "Fame teaches you how to pose, not how to breathe." The illusion of perfect love had lasted longer than anyone expected, held together by photographs, contracts, and denial. But illusions are fragile things. They shimmer only as long as no one looks too closely. And soon, the lights of Vegas would burn brighter than the lights at home. The king's kingdom would expand, but the marriage would shrink, one silent mile at a time. Because perfection, in Hollywood, is never free. It demands sacrifice. And the first offering is always truth. The first cracks appeared quietly, like hairline fractures in glass. They began not with betrayal, but with distance, a kind of invisible gravity that pulled them into different worlds. Elvis lived in the glare of 1,000 spotlights. Priscilla lived in their shadow. In the beginning, she told herself it was temporary. Every concert, every tour, every late-night recording session would eventually end, and the man she fell in love with would walk through the door again. But the more famous he became, the further he drifted. Each ovation took him a little farther from home. Fame, she would later say, was like another woman in the marriage, jealous, possessive, and impossible to compete with. By 1970, the illusion of domestic peace had become impossible to maintain. Elvis World operated by its own strange laws, nocturnal rhythms, endless entourages, constant motion. The Memphis Mafia acted as both protection and prison walls. Wherever he went, they went bodyguards, cousins, friends, all orbiting the king like loyal planets around a burning sun. Priscilla had once thought of them as family. Now she saw them as gatekeepers. There was no conversation too private, no moment too intimate, that didn't echo with footsteps in the hallway. She was 25 and already living like a widow. Elvis, meanwhile, was fighting demons no stage could exorcise. The pills began as helpers to wake up, to sleep, to keep the voice steady. But soon they became his invisible orchestra, conducting every hour of his life. The same hands that played the piano trembled when he tried to button his shirt. He laughed, but the laughter had a rhythm, up when the drugs hit, hollow when they faded. At first, Priscilla tried to save him. She organized his medication, spoke to doctors, pleaded with his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, to reduce the schedule. Parker refused. "America doesn't want rest. It wants Elvis," he said. The machine had no off switch. Their conversations shrank into fragments, greetings, apologies, silences. When she asked him why he never stopped, he smiled weakly. "If I stop, baby, they'll forget me." In that one sentence, she heard the sound of a man haunted by immortality. In public, the story remained immaculate. Photos of family picnics, of laughter in the garden, of the couple embracing at airports. Behind closed doors, Graceland had become a museum of ghosts. He slept by day and wandered by night, pacing the halls like an actor rehearsing for a play that no longer existed. Sometimes she followed him, barefoot on the carpet, afraid to wake him from whatever dream he was trapped in. Once, she found him at 3 a.m. in the music room, talking softly to his reflection in the glass. "They love me, but they don't know me," he murmured. When she touched his shoulder, he flinched as if her hand were a camera flash. In those moments, she understood he was surrounded by millions, yet utterly alone. The tabloids would later blame the end of their marriage on affairs, whispers of co-stars, secret trysts, fleeting encounters. But the truth, as Priscilla would later admit, was quieter and far more painful. He didn't betray me with a woman. He betrayed me with his absence. When she spoke, she meant more than physical distance. She meant the slow disappearance of the man behind the legend, the tenderness that had once made her feel chosen. The love that used to belong to her had been divided into 1,000 pieces and sold as tickets. By 1971, she began to disappear too. In interviews, she smiled at home. She drifted through rooms that no longer felt her own. The cameras outside Graceland captured perfection. Inside, she was losing her sense of self. She was no longer Priscilla Presley, the girl who loved a man. She was Mrs. Pot Presley, property of a myth. To survive, she created small rebellions, horse riding lessons, karate classes, moments of solitude that reminded her she was alive. But even these sparks of freedom triggered jealousy. Elvis, increasingly paranoid, called at all hours, demanding to know where she was. "I need to protect you," he said. But what he meant was, "I need to control what's left of you." Control had become his last refuge. Fame had stripped him of privacy, youth, and trust. She was the only territory he could still command. The irony was cruel. The man who could fill stadiums feared being left alone, and the woman who lived in his house felt like a prisoner. Their arguments were rarely loud, just long stretches of silence, punctuated by exhaustion. She wanted to talk. He wanted to forget. Sometimes, she found him in the bathroom, surrounded by empty bottles, eyes glassy, whispering lyrics to songs no one had yet heard. "You can't live like this," she cried once. He smiled faintly. "I am not living, baby. I am performing." The truth hit her like a final curtain drop. The man she loved no longer existed outside of applause. By 1972, the space between them had become unbearable. Priscilla began seeing Mike Stone, her karate instructor, not out of betrayal, but out of exhaustion. In him, she found something simple, quiet, stability, the feeling of being seen. When Elvis found out, he was devastated. Rage, pills, and heartbreak collided. One night, in a storm of fury and despair, he fired a gun at a television set as her name appeared on the screen. No one was hurt, but the message was unmistakable. The empire was collapsing. Yet even in that chaos, Priscilla insisted she still loved him. "I left to save us," she would later say. "If I had stayed, there would have been nothing left of either of us." In truth, she had been planning her exit for years, packing memories instead of suitcases, collecting pieces of herself he hadn't taken. On February 23, 1972, she walked out of Graceland with their daughter in her arms. Elvis stood by the staircase, silent. He didn't try to stop her. He simply looked at her, and for a moment, she saw the boy from Germany again, frightened, tender, lost. Then he turned away. The tabloids screamed betrayal, scandal, adultery. But the real scandal was simpler. Fame had eaten them alive, and love was the first casualty. After the separation, Elvis spiraled deeper. The tours multiplied. The pills increased. The nights grew longer. Priscilla, meanwhile, tried to rebuild her life quietly. She studied acting, opened a boutique, raised Lisa Marie. But even in her new independence, the shadow of Graceland followed her. Everywhere she went, people asked about him. "Do you miss him?" they'd say. She always answered softly, "Every day, but not the way you think." She didn't miss the legend. She missed the man who used to whisper songs to her in the dark before the world demanded an encore. That is the truth. Hollywood never wanted to hear that love and fame cannot share the same house for long. One feeds on silence, the other devours it. When Elvis died in August 1977, she was the first to arrive at Graceland. Reporters saw a composed woman, elegant and dignified. They didn't see the tremor in her hands as she touched the casket, whispering words no microphone could catch. She didn't cry in front of the cameras. She had already done all her crying years before. Later, she would say only this: "He was the love of my life." But you can't hold on to someone who belongs to the world. That was the secret beneath the legend, not scandal, but sorrow, not betrayal, but inevitability. Elvis Presley didn't leave Priscilla for another woman. He left because he no longer knew how to be human in a world that worshipped his reflection. And Priscilla, the woman who once waited for him to come home, finally understood you can love a man deeply and still need to walk away to survive. Time has a way of softening legends, but not of healing the people left inside them. For decades after his death, Priscilla Presley stayed silent, guarding his name, raising their daughter, managing the empire of a man who no longer existed. Graceland became a shrine, visited by millions who whispered prayers as if at a holy place. Yet every corner of that house was a wound only she could recognize. She lived among his echoes, the faint scent of cologne in the curtains, the piano that still held his fingerprints, the photograph of them smiling as though the world had never broken them. And then, on the eve of her 78th birthday, she finally spoke, not to a journalist or a crowd, but to a quiet audience and a single camera. Her words came slowly, the way confessions do when they've waited half a lifetime. "People always ask why I left," she said. "They want a villain or a scandal. But the truth is simpler. I didn't stop loving him, I stopped surviving him." For the first time, she described the life behind the glitter, the insomnia, the pills, the way his eyes dulled after every show. She spoke of his tenderness, how he'd whisper, "Priscilla, don't leave the light on. I'll be right back," and how she eventually realized right back could mean hours, days, or never. The king, she said, was haunted not by women or fame, but by the emptiness that fame created. He wanted to be loved, but he didn't know how to live being loved by everyone. "The man I married couldn't stay because the world never let him rest." Her voice trembled, but her eyes stayed steady blue, reflective, almost detached, as if she were describing someone else's story. Perhaps that was the only way to survive it. The interviewer asked the question the world had waited 50 years to hear. "Do you still love him?" She smiled faintly. "I think love changes shape. It doesn't disappear. It becomes a ghost that walks beside you. Elvis will always walk beside me." Then came the shock, not scandalous, but devastatingly human. "The truth is, Elvis didn't die on that bathroom floor," she said softly. "Had been leaving for years, leaving rooms, conversations, promises. The king couldn't stay, because being Elvis meant never being home." That sentence hung in the air like a verdict. It reframed every headline, every photograph, every myth. Elvis Presley, the man who gave the world its heartbeat, had lost his own long before 1977. As Priscilla spoke, she didn't sound angry. There was no bitterness, only understanding, the kind that comes after years of silence and sleepless nights. "I was angry once," she admitted, "but grief and anger live in the same house. After a while, you have to evict one of them." For her, the eviction happened slowly, each time she watched a fan cry at Graceland's gates. Each time a young musician sang "Can't Help Falling in Love" as if he'd just written it. She realized the world would never let him go. So she did. She described her last visit to his resting place. When the tourists had gone and only the cicadas sang, she placed a single white rose on the grave and whispered, "You're free now." Then she turned to the camera and said something that felt like both confession and warning. "If you love someone who belongs to the world, be prepared to lose them to it. The spotlight is a jealous thing." For a moment, the silence that followed was almost holy. When the interview aired, the world reacted the way it always does headlines. debates, nostalgia. Some called it closure, others called it betrayal. But to those who listened carefully, it was neither. It was liberation for her, and perhaps for him. In her words, there was no attempt to rewrite history, only to reclaim it. She had spent her youth as a supporting character in someone else's legend. Now, in her late years, she became the narrator. People think he was larger than life, she said. But he was just life fragile, bright, impossible to hold. The revelation wasn't a secret uncovered, but a truth finally spoken aloud. That love can exist without rescue. That devotion can coexist with escape. And that sometimes the kindest act of love is leaving before everything beautiful turns to ruin. For the first time in half a century, Priscilla allowed herself to speak as a woman, not as the widow of a king. She didn't ask for pity, she asked for understanding. Elvis and I were two halves of a dream that couldn't survive. Waking up, she concluded. As the lights dimmed and the camera faded to black, her final words lingered, gentle but unyielding. He didn't leave me. Fame did. And once you understand that, you stop blaming him and you start forgiving yourself. It was the confession the world never expected, not a scandal, but a requiem. The revelation that the greatest love stories aren't the ones that last forever, but the ones that teach us how to let go. Graceland at dawn. The gates stand open for the morning tour. The air smells of magnolia and rain. Somewhere, a distant recording of Love Me Tender drifts through the speakers, a ghost singing to a new century. Priscilla walks through the halls quietly, her heels barely touching the polished floors. She has walked these corridors 1,000 times, but they no longer echo with pain. Only memory. The suits in the glass cases are frozen mid-motion, sequins catching the first light. The piano sits under a dustless cloth, waiting for hands that will never play again. She stops by the nursery, Lisa Mary's old room, and lets her fingers trace the edge of the crib. The years collapse. For a moment, she can almost hear laughter. The faint sound of Elvis humming lullabies in the next room. Long before fame turned their home into a museum. Outside, the world still calls him the king. To her, he remains simply Elvis, the boy who sang to her in a small house in Germany, the man who never stopped running from the shadow of his own voice. It took her half a lifetime to understand what their love truly was, not a tragedy, but a translation, two souls speaking different languages under the same sky. She loved him in the language of silence, he loved her in the language of music. Between them stood the noise of the world. In the end, that noise won. But love quiet, stubborn, unfinished, survived. Now, as she stands before the grave, she finally allows herself to feel what she could never admit in her 20s, that some loves are not meant to last, only to shape us. He was my beginning, she whispers, and my lesson. The marble bears a single word, Elvis. No surname, no dates, as if even time were unworthy to define him. Around her, tourists begin to gather with flowers, phones, tears. She steps aside, blending into the crowd. For the first time, she is no longer the guardian of his myth. She is simply a witness to what remains. There's a strange peace in that. In loving someone larger than life, she learned the quiet discipline of letting go. Fame devours, but real love endures in the spaces fame can't reach. It lingers in the hush before a song begins, in the pause between words, in the sigh of a woman who once stood in the wings and watched her husband become a god. Years later, when asked what she would tell her younger self, Priscilla answered softly, "Don't confuse being chosen with being seen. Love doesn't need a spotlight, it needs a heartbeat." Perhaps that is the legacy of their story, not the heartbreak, not the legend, but the reminder that even icons bleed, that even the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. Elvis Presley will always be the king, but behind every crown is a story of a man who wanted to be loved, and a woman who finally learned to love herself. As the sun rises over Graceland, the marble glows gold for a moment before fading back into stillness. The music fades too, leaving only the sound of wind moving through the trees. And in that silence, the kind he never found, the kind she finally did, the story ends. Because in the end, even kings cannot stay. Only love does quiet, unclaimed, eternal.